Hello and welcome to Science Matters, a very special presentation by the Science magazine. I'm Pallav Bagla, coming to you from the southern Indian city of Hyderabad, the happening city, the only city in India which has a genome valley, a city which has made science and embraced it. We are here to discuss the future of genetic modification and genetic technology in India. India embraced genetically modified cotton more than 10 years ago. Today, more than 10 million hectares of genetically modified cotton grows in India. The farmers have embraced it. More than 90% of the cropped area is cultivated using genetically modified BT cotton. But in contrast, 3 years ago, the Indian government rebuffed the entry of the genetically modified eggplant or the aubergine. The baigan or the brinjal as we call it in India was to be introduced as a BT brinjal for controlling pests. After an intense debate and discussion, it was rebuffed and the technology was not commercialized. There is a petition pending in the Supreme Court of India to discuss and come up with the ruling on what will happen, whether BT brinjal is safe, whether Indian public should have BT brinjal or the genetically modified eggplant or not. The judgment is expected soon. But in debate, this particular plant, the brinjal, became a hot potato, a very hot controversy. And the rejection of its introduction had a certain setback on research and development and science in India and across the world. We have a very high-powered panel to discuss the benefits of introduction or rebuffing this particular technology, which is BT brinjal. We have with us Dr. G. Padmanabhan, a biochemist and former director of the Indian Institute of Science, Bangalore, to talk about proposing that genetic modification is good and should be adopted. We also have with us a very distinguished scientist, Dr. Pushpa Bhargav, another biochemist, the founding director of the Center for Cellular Molecular Biology in Hyderabad. Two people with opposing views, but being moderated in a very special panel by our very own affable Dr. Bruce Alberts, a cell biologist of high repute and the former president of the National Academy of Sciences. So we debate here the future of genetic modification in India and the world. So now it's over to Bruce to take the debate forward and see if he can bring consensus and agreement at the end.
It's a pleasure to be here in Hyderabad. We're going to use the kind of rules for this debate, a very important issue for India and the world that was used in at least one of the presidential debates in the United States this year, in which I will ask a series of questions, and each scientist will have 3 minutes to answer, or 3 minutes or less to answer, and then the other scientist will answer that same question. That will be followed by me asking a second question, and I hope that we can get through 6 questions in this way today. For this general debate, I'd like to focus not on the past, but on the future of this GM issue. But I would like to start with the current issue that we were introduced to related to this important food crop for India. And it's called eggplant in the United States. It's called brinjal in India. So I would like each of you, starting with Dr. Bhargava, to give me your impression of the indefinite moratorium that was imposed at a high level in Indian government about 2 years ago on the release of BT brinjal for commercial cultivation. That was announced by Jairam Ramesh, who was then Minister of the Environment and Forests.
Well, I believe that the moratorium that was put, indefinite moratorium that was put on open release of BT brinjal was perfectly justified because people did not want it. Jairam Ramesh was then the Minister for Environment and Forests, and who was responsible for this indefinite moratorium, had about 7 or 8 public meetings spread all over the country, and the overwhelming opinion was that it wouldn't be in the interest of people in India to have the cheapest vegetable which is available all around the year, that is brinjal, to be genetically engineered, and that genetically engineered brinjal available for, without labeling, for consumption by people. And they felt that they had the right to decide what they were going to eat, what they will not eat. So to say it again, I think the indefinite moratorium was perfectly justified.
How would you like to reply to that?
I do believe this moratorium was very unfortunate. Actually, BT brinjal was thought in terms of demonstrating a proof of principle so far as a food crop is concerned. I personally believe India would need BT rice at some point of time. So this moratorium has sent a very wrong signal, in my opinion, a decision which was more populistic than based on science as such. And actually what has happened is it has depressed most of the scientists in the area. This is something which the country should worry about. A lot of scientists who are in the area, I work on malaria, it doesn't matter. But there are people who are in this field, they have lost the enthusiasm to get into, even students are not willing to get into this area, which I think is very, very unfortunate for India.
Okay, thank you. That was very prompt. You didn't have to wave any sign. My second question, we'll start with Dr. Padmanabhan, relates to a recent publication by M.S. Swaminathan, a distinguished leader of the Green Revolution in India, agricultural scientist. He published in December 2012 in Frontiers in Genetics an article entitled, "This I Believe, Agricultural Science and Genetics." The article starts with this sentence, and I'm going to ask each of you whether you agree or disagree with this statement. He said, "I believe that the current concerns of biosafety and the impact of GMOs on biodiversity will soon give way to an appreciation of the potential benefits that the new genetics can confer on humankind."
As a general statement, people do make this statement often, but I personally believe this biodiversity card is overplayed. After all, you will see genes have been transferred vertically, horizontally, all through evolution. For example, you look at the rice genome. How many fungal genes are there? How many viral genes are there? How many bacterial genes are there? There is nothing like a pure rice genome. So to think a couple of genes would alter the biodiversity, I really do not buy that argument, because in nature, every plant has been modified in nature. The only concern in my perception is whether the gene we are introducing is safe enough. But to generally state that biodiversity will be affected, I have not understood why should biodiversity be affected by introducing a couple of genes, when in nature, so many genes have been floating across. It has happened. So I'm not able to appreciate this argument that biodiversity is going to be affected. Of course, safety is a prime concern. I have no argument on that. Safety is needed. But once that, for example, BT itself, I can take it as an example. Millions of people have been consuming BT corn for over 15 years. Americans, Canadians, Chinese, South Africans, Argentinians, Brazilians. And I have not seen any authenticated report of anything that has come out of consuming BT corn. It's not only used in cattle feed, it's also used in the human, I think breakfast cereal is all BT corn. So I have not seen any authenticated report of any environmental risk or health risk so far as this is concerned. So having established in my perception that BT gene is safe, Similar, perhaps you need certain trials, etc. For example, in BT brinjal, it was an 8-year trial. It's not as if overnight somebody decided BT brinjal should come in. No, and many scientists were involved in this process. Of course, people do find fault. This was not done properly, that was not done properly. But in my perception, BT gene as a whole should have very, as you do it in pharma, there should be a fast track clearance whenever BT gene is used. That's my perception.
So actually, you're even ahead of Dr. Swaminathan, because Swaminathan was saying here that the current concerns will disappear soon. And you certainly agree with that. You don't even agree with that concerns not.
I do definitely agree with that.
Yes.
Current concerns, I hope it will disappear. But there is I feel a deliberate attempt in India to keep raising these concerns.
Okay, Dr. Bhargava?
Well, as far as Swaminathan's statement is concerned, I think it's a very neutral statement that when these concerns will cease to exist, now that may take 50 years, that may take 100 years, that may take 5 years. So it's a neutral statement. As regards the other issues that my friend Padmanabhan has raised, well, actually there is a great deal of evidence that there have been health problems amongst Americans, especially related to allergy, since the consumption of large-scale consumption of BT corn or GM corn and GM soya started in the US. In fact, if you plot qualitatively the increase in the incidence of GI disorders, gastrointestinal disorders amongst Americans over the last 12 to 13 years, and the increase in the consumption of GM food, the two curves seem to overlap very substantially. So, and there is evidence in Latin America and Brazil, where there has been increased consumption of GM crops, that there is increase in the incidence of childhood cancer and several other problems. So I think this to say that there is no evidence of any deleterious effect on human health, on animal health, on plant health, and on biodiversity, I think is ignoring tremendous amount of evidence that exists to say that these effects are very real. For example, there is an Indian paper which talks about the fact that when you put in BT gene in brinjal or in cotton, there is a deleterious effect on the growth and development of the plant. There is a very recent paper which says that animals which were fed GM corn and other GM food material had much higher incidence of cancer than animals that were not fed any GM material. So I think there is an increasing amount of evidence which supports the view that the GM food can be deleterious to human health, to animal health, to plant health, and to biodiversity and conservation.
So the National Academy of Sciences, I was president of that organization from 1993 to 2005. And during my term, many reports on this issue were published. I'll just start with the general principles that were announced starting in 1987, which I'd like to know whether you agree with this. The principles have been reaffirmed in subsequent reports. Basically, the statement is that the risk associated with the introduction of GM organisms are the same in kind as those associated with the introduction of unmodified organisms and organisms modified by other methods. Assessments of the risk of introducing GM organisms into the environment should be based on the nature of the organism and the environment in which it is introduced, not on the method by which it was produced. And then basically discussing pest-protected plants, a statement in a 2000 report that toxicity, allergenicity, effects of gene flow, development of resistant pests, and effects on non-target species are concerns for both conventional and pest-protected plants. Dr. Bhargava, do you?
Yeah, I agree with that. I think there's nothing wrong with that statement. It's a neutral statement and fair statement. But it doesn't say that one should accept all GM crops without safety testing.
Yeah, that's fine, that's a statement. But the statement really says the GM risk is no more than the risk which you see with conventional breeding. In fact, I have seen reports where they have analyzed something like papers published by 25 groups, a detailed analysis of many projects, come to the conclusion, and it's a conclusion in the European context, where there is a lot of conservatism about GM crops.
Yes.
And these have been published in EMBO reports, 2012. And you can see that clearly, in fact, they say risk analysis is much more expensive than doing research in GM itself. So we are wasting our time trying to put more and more regulatory controls, and so that it becomes very expensive. The crop becomes expensive because of that, actually. The bottom line is, it's as safe or it is not as safe like any other breeding strategies.
You're saying that the regulatory rules for GM crops are very different than for ordinary crops.
Extraordinarily tough,
Yeah.
which makes it very, very expensive. And those are all brought out in that article which I said.
So in that connection, Dr. Bhargava, you published in June 2009 in the Journal of Bioscience a commentary, which I'm sure you're familiar with, on GM crops in India. In that commentary, I hope you've seen that, he listed 29 different tests that, quote, must be done, unquote, on GM plants intended to be released in the environment. A very long, detailed list. Do you still believe that those 29 are essential?
Oh, absolutely, yes. And all of them may not be essential for every crop, but by and large, they are essential for GM crops. And this is not only my view, there's a view of a very large number of very distinguished scientists from institutes such as Salk Institutes or King's College London and so on. In fact, very recently, 51 internationally known scientists, including people like Frank Stahl of the Mendelssohn-Stahl experiment, have issued a statement which supports what I said in my Journal of Biosciences article.
Well, that doesn't seem to accord with the National Academy of Sciences statement. I thought that you accepted that both types of crops present similar risks. So why should you have a very different type of regulation for one than for the other?
No, see, we say that all drugs pose certain risks, but when we test a particular drug, we test it for what it is claimed to do. So I think making a general statement that there are risks in both genetically modified crops and crops modified other ways, it doesn't mean that the same tests need to be done for both. It only is a qualitative statement. There are risks in both, but the nature of risks and the way that these risks have to be assessed would be very vastly different in the two cases. And I think the fact is that the GM crops are used in a very small number of countries. Less than 5% of agricultural land is under GM crops, and 90% members of UN countries, members of UN, do not allow GM crops at all. Europe doesn't do that. It requires labeling. The European Food Safety Authority has now added another look in the light of the Seralini's experiments on induction of tumors by GM crops and fed to animals. So I think there is a tremendous amount of opinion which is growing day by day that when we are dealing with GM crops, we have to be far more strict than we need to be when we are dealing with crops that emerge in natural way. Again, this is not to say that there are no risks involved. The nature of risk is different. The nature of risk assessment will have to be different.
How do you respond to that?
Personally, I believe some of the tests could be superfluous, but nevertheless, some tests need to be done to instill confidence in the people. That concern is always there. People should believe that these tests have been done. But there is an irony here. There's a process called wide hybridization, where wild type crops are crossed with the cultivable crops. And all kinds of genes have been transferred. Tosint became modern corn, hybridizing with a rye grass. And there are now examples of such wholesale transfer of genes from totally unrelated wild species. And there has been no regulation for that. We are all happy that we got the corn. So what I'm trying to say is certain tests are to be done, seem to be done because to instill public confidence. And in my opinion, there is no point in keep on adding tests and make the process very expensive.
So do you have a view as to how many of the 29 are really important?
I don't know how many that are needed. I think originally the Codex Alimentarius and others have listed certain tests. For example, in BT Brinjal case also, all those tests have been done. Also, Pushpa doesn't agree that they were done properly. That's a different debate one can have. But do we really need to add more and more tests? I do not agree that. Whatever has been decided in the international community, I think it's enough if we follow that.
So I think I'd like both of you to, this is a science debate, we're talking about science, and Dr. Bhargava raised this issue of scientific evidence for special toxicity. I think it's important to know what research you're referring to and whether you both read the same papers and whether you would both agree that those scientific analyses do imply that people eating, say, BT corn are having health problems. Of course, it's always very hard to get an association. We have autism increasing drastically in the United States, and everybody attributes many different things to it, but nobody really understands. We have no evidence about what's causing it. So what are the, maybe I ask Dr. Bhargava first, which is the most critical publication that you would refer to make your point?
Well, there isn't really just one. I think there are a number of very critical publications. I mentioned Seralini's paper. I've read it, so have many others.
Which paper?
A paper by Seralini, which makes the point that animals, rats which were fed GM food material developed tumors at a much higher rate, significantly much higher rate than animals which were not fed, or which were fed just normal.
This is a paper from France?
This is a paper from France. Okay. Then there's a paper from India. Again, I know the authors very well, very reputed, very reliable people who have shown that introduction of BT gene both in brinjal, eggplant, and in cotton leads to deleterious effect on development and growth of the plant. So I'm just giving you some examples. Okay, but there are a very, very large number of examples. In fact, I have a whole presentation on deleterious health effects on humans, on animals, and on plant of GM crops. These are by people whose scientific credibility is not in doubt.
Dr. Babu.
Seralini's papers have been rejected by the European Food Protection Agency, and the data have been analyzed, and clearly they have found there are very marginal changes, and they have not agreed with the statistics employed by Seralini. And I would like to recommend one particular book which is written by the director of the National Cotton Research Institute in India. It's opposed to BT cotton, but it covers a large ground. It is called as BT cotton 100 Questions and Answers. That covers all publications which went again. Most of them have not done original experiments. They are all interpretation of data submitted by Monsanto or any of such companies. And scientists have felt these are all within the normal range of changes. And the statistics is flawed.
So in these cases, you always find scientists say, I wrote an editorial about this recently in Science. There's science with a small s, the experiments that an individual does. But the common knowledge that drives the world that we depend on for advance of society, you could call that science with a capital S. And that only comes from every scientist repeating everybody else's results, trying to refute them. You all know this very well. So unfortunately, the public doesn't really understand that. So, in fact, any experiment that's been done that makes such an important claim obviously has to be repeated and tested and so on before it becomes part of capital S science. And in my country, the National Academy of Sciences, where I spent 12 years, has a huge role in trying to resolve what is small science and what is big S science. And I mentioned one of the reports on this issue, but basically what you have to do, of course, is you have to get a bunch of scientists on all sides of the spectra with different kinds of expertise and different starting opinions to agree that they're going to consult with each other, use evidence, and come to some kind of consensus as much as they can on what really, of all that small S science, what does that add up to in the way of big S science that we have to rely on? And India has 3 science academies, a agricultural academy, and a medical. We have many academies. So, but most academies around the world weren't chartered like my academy by President Abraham Lincoln. When we got a charter in 1863, we were required to advise the government, and so that means 200 reports a year we put out on every kind of questions that the government asks. So you are both distinguished institution builders, and I'd like to ask you going forward, what role do you think the academies can and should have in trying to resolve the kind of issues we're discussing and many others? This is just one of many, many examples. Do you want to start with that?
Well, I think in principle what you say is absolutely correct, that academies should have a major role. But unfortunately in our country, if I may say so, academies have played virtually no role. And I resigned from the fellowship of all the 3 national science academies in I think 1994, just for this reason that they're socially sterile, if I may use the term. Now coming back to the earlier point, you know, Seralini used exactly the same technique and same methodology that Monsanto had used, on the basis of which we declared that Bt gene did not confer any toxicity on the plant. So why is it that when Monsanto does it, we all accept it? We don't say that it needs to be repeated. But when somebody else does it, which gives you different results, we begin to question that. The fact is that in both cases, we need to question. And questioning should not be confined just to what X does and not what Y does. So that, I think, is something that worries us. In the case of, for example, drugs, I'm very familiar with that area as well. There is a set of tests that are done. They're very stringent tests, and it costs enormous amount of money to develop one particular drug, get it to the market, you know, 1.5 to 3 or 4 billion dollars. So I think we need to use the same yardstick in every case. That's not what we have been doing. And I must repeat that in the case of Seralini's experiments, they followed exactly the same protocol that was followed by Monsanto, on the basis of which we declared that it was completely risk-free.
But you agree they have to be repeated?
Obviously, but nobody said that Monsanto's experiment should be repeated. I think that both of them should be repeated.
Yes.
Monsanto,
Both
in
of
fact,
them,
refused to do long-term experiments. Seralini did long-term experiments using the same protocol.
So do you think that the Academy can step up the plate, the academies?
Oh, absolutely. I think National Academy and the Royal Society, National Academy in the United States, the Royal Society in Britain, they have done a wonderful job. They have marvelous history to back their claims. And when the National Academy of Sciences in the US or the Royal Society in Britain say something, we do take it very seriously. Now, coming to this claim of Seralini, the European Food Safety Authority has taken it very seriously. It's not correct to say that nobody has taken any
They have
note of it.
rejected it, Pushpa.
Okay, it's your turn.
Not the
I can't make a statement if it is not.
not the present claim. They did that very early in the game, not now.
Anyway, I can argue on Seralini and others because I've read them. I can keep on pointing out the flaws, and he may not agree on those. Instead, I do believe academies are a very important role. Indian National Science Academy, at least I would think this is a subject which all the academies should come together and initiate a debate. The other day, the president of the Indian National Science Academy has been talking to me saying that he would like to revisit this subject. They did generate a report which resulted in actual controversies actually. See, an academy report should be final, kind of, it should be authentic so far as science is concerned. Unfortunately, it did not happen. So therefore, he is saying now we will revisit the whole thing and initiate a debate, and then both sides let us discuss, and then we will bring a document which should be useful. I do agree academies have a tremendous role to play.
Yes, but what our academies did, the inter-academy report was a disaster.
That's what I say. Yes. It would be a good job of it.
Okay, let's go to another question. Thank you. We're talking about academies. The most recent report, as far as I know, from our academy on this issue is called The Impact of Genetically Engineered Crops on Farm Sustainability in the United States, 270 pages, published in 2010. Turns out, I didn't realize that since 1996, when GM crops were first introduced in the United States, they've expanded enormously, and now GM cotton, corn, and soybeans that are engineered to resist insect pests or herbicides, mostly glyphosate, now are planted in about half of all U.S. croplands. Enormous. So a massive experiment has been done, and this was the first time that this has been analyzed. It's a study of the environmental, economic, and social impacts. Everybody could read it. It's freely downloadable from the Academy website. The conclusion is that I'm going to quote, GM crops offer substantial net environmental and economic benefits compared to conventional crops. And I just want to mention Peter Raven, who's a great friend of India, a distinguished plant scientist who spent his entire life focusing on promoting biodiversity. For 30 years, he was the director of the Missouri Botanical Garden, a very distinguished person. He said, and I'm sure you all agree with this, nothing has driven more species to extinction or caused more instability in the world's ecological systems than the development of an agriculture sufficient to feed 6 billion people. I mean, and we're going to 10 billion people. But he also added, and I think you may disagree, he said, to assert that GM techniques are a threat to biodiversity is the exact opposite of the truth. Would you like to react to that?
I do agree, but only caution I have to say is GM is one of the technologies that we need to go after. It's not as if GM is going to be the answer for every trait and every crop. I believe we need to use it very selectively, and experts should decide which trait, which crop should really use. For example, I can tell you, Ingo Potricus developed golden rice, which initially was 1.5 microgram per gram. Today it is 37 microgram per gram.
Of what?
Of
vitamin
beta-carotene, vitamin A. And
Yes.
they say about 140 grams of that rice is adequate for children. At the same time, the same thing has also been achieved using non-transgenic, but the levels are much, much lower. So I would rather go for golden rice, which is a transgenic, which involved 2 gene transfers. So in every case, it's possible to decide. And I also think we need to go beyond BT, in my opinion. We need to look at nutrition. We need to look at abiotic stress. Tomorrow, nitrogen contamination is going to be a huge issue. Water availability is going to be a huge issue. Should we not be looking at technologies to conserve water? And there are very good genes that can do that job actually. To my mind, this country is getting lost just talking BT and BT cotton. Of course, it is contextual because that is the only success story which we are trying to dent. But I do believe it has much, much larger scope of application.
Well, as far as golden rice is concerned, we can do exactly what the best of the golden rice can do by eating 1 carrot, which is much cheaper. That's more than enough to give you a daily requirement of vitamin A. As far as BT cotton is concerned, I think to make a statement that it has been an unqualified success in India is really absurd. BT cotton has worked initially only in irrigated areas, and 2/3 of area under cotton in India is not irrigated, and unirrigated areas it has not worked. In fact, there are a large number of cotton farmer suicides, and they're almost entirely of those farmers who had no success with BT cotton. So BT cotton has not been an unqualified success. In fact, the contribution of BT gene to net yield in BT cotton is not more than 3 to 4%, because you can't compare apples and oranges. We normally compare, unfortunately, BT cotton yields with varieties and not even with hybrids, which would be isogenic. So we have to be very careful when we make statements about unqualified success of X or Y.
Can I reply to that?
Okay, all right. Well, then he has to come back again too. Okay, go ahead.
No, I just thought, the problem with BT gene, despite all that, is selection of wrong hybrids. Why it has not done well in unirrigated areas is they have chosen hybrids, varieties which were made hybrid, which were long duration. You need short duration in areas where rainfall is, it's not, the point I'm trying to make is not a problem with the technology. It's a problem with choosing. There are 1,120 hybrids in India with BT, which is, in my opinion, is a wrong judgment, to strategy to put, I agree with Pushpa, we should have had varieties.
Yes.
Varieties which contain BT rather
You
than.
want to reply to that?
Well, I think Padmavan has agreed with what I have said in principle. As I said that earlier, that there is nothing wrong with the technology of genetic engineering. I was the chairman of the first National Committee on Genetic Engineering in this country, and I can claim to have brought this technology to this country, to our country. But the problem is, what do you do with it? If you use it to make drugs, nobody objects to it. But when you use it to produce something that you're going to release in the environment, that's a totally different cup of tea, because you can't recall it.
So the last question, we're almost out of time, changes the subject slightly. I had a discussion earlier this week with M.K. Bond, Dr. M.K. Bond, who until recently was the Secretary of the Department of Biotechnology in New Delhi, of course. What I heard from him is he regrets that we're mixing up, and people in the world, but also in, specifically he was now talking about India, 4 separate issues when we debate about GM crops. In this vigorous debate that India is now embroiled in it. First is unhappiness with the dominant role played by a U.S. company, a very large company, Monsanto, and its partners in India. That's one concern. Second, fear of the economic effects of the new seeds on small Indian farmers. It's an economic concern. 3, biosafety concerns regarding new food crops. We've been discussing that, whether when you eat BT it has any effects on humans or not. And 4, environmental concerns regarding the new food crops. So as a scientist, of course, we could all agree that we need to keep things clear, what we're discussing. Do you agree that there's an unfortunate mixing up of these different concerns? I guess you should go first.
Yeah, one concern is there that, multinationals will dictate Indian agriculture. That concern has been there. But at the same time, the farmer still goes for the BT crop or the BT seeds. That is because it's not available in the public sector research. That is where I feel we need to give a competition. And that is where I feel the embargo is actually dampening the enthusiasm of people who will be working in these areas. Like the Chinese, in my opinion, are very smart. They encourage Monsanto on one hand, and they will also say our own scientists have developed this. They have a dual policy. I believe we are driven by emotions. Now, we really need to work it out. Sir, I can tell you one statistics which I said in Science Academy, Chinese Science Academy. They have something like 6,000 PhDs in agri-biotech. India has 8,900 PhDs in all sciences put together. So unless we have a large workforce to deliver these, I do not see how our public sector is going to compete with multinational companies. There is no point in blaming. I mean, of course, we are competing in auto sector. We will say Maruti Suzuki, we can compete, which is also a Chinese collaboration. At least we have something there which we can say as Indian. So unless I believe, I agree, we need to encourage our public sector scientists to come up with products. I do believe that. But other concerns are which we have discussed earlier, environment, safety,
Yes.
we have discussed it a lot.
Yes. Dr. Bhargava?
Well, what Bhan has said, I think, makes a lot of sense. That these are the kind of qualitatively the major issues,
Yes.
and we need to address them. It doesn't mean that we accept anything and everything that X or Y says. We have to put it to scrutiny, as you very rightly said. In science, we must see whether it's repeatable, whether it's the precedence or not, and there are other tests by which we sanctify a scientific statement. So that is what needs to be done. And I think it's what has happened is that anything and anybody who says something which is positive in favor of GM crops, we don't want it to be repeated, we accept it. But anyone who says something which is against GM crops, we say, well, it must be, this must be done, that must be done. How can we accept that? That, I think, is not fair.
Okay, we have one last chance for final remarks. Who wants to go first? You want to go first?
Well, I think we must recognize that GM technology is a fantastic technology. If the history of last century is written, let's say, 500 years from now, it will be amongst the top 10 technologies developed in the 20th century. And it has given us drugs. I think 3 of the 10 most highly selling drugs are made through GM technology. So technology is fantastic. The question is, how do we use it? When we use it to make these drugs, nobody objects to it. Because if the drug doesn't work, you stop making it. But when you use it to develop GM crops, which you will release in the environment, you have to be very careful, because once you release a plant in the environment, you cannot recall it. In India, we have had that problem with water hyacinth. We had that problem with Parthenium. We wasted an enormous amount of money on these two plants that we never had 60 years ago in the country. So we have to be very, very careful, and that's why it is, as in drugs, in the case of drugs, the number of tests that are required to be done is phenomenal, and is increasing as our understanding increases. The number of tests keeps on increasing before a drug is released in the environment. So why can't we be just as stringent with the case of GM crops?
Your last word,
Um,
Dr. Putman.
As I said earlier, I think transgenic is only one of the options. Agri-biotech, in my opinion, is much broader in scope. For example, you have marker-assisted breeding, changes of individual genes, targeted modification of genes. All these are possible today. There is so much of information, the zinc finger nuclease. People are using to target a specific gene and bring about changes which are required actually. Now these will not be covered by any of the regulations actually. There is a very surprising element I find. Radiation mediated, we have a cobalt garden in which you generate mutants, and that is all accepted. That will be the founding plant for generating them. And I am sure hundreds of genes have been changed there. We are not objecting to that. I think India should should be bolder in its decisions. I don't say you should go only with GM. I don't necessarily feel that it's the only technology that can deliver. But wherever it has a potential, I think we should use it, and we should worry about nutrition. In my opinion, millions of children are dying of malnutrition, undernutrition, and this is a technology that can deliver. It can also deliver against excess nitrogen use, fertilizer use, or abiotic stress in general. These are tremendous technology options are there, and I think India should go that way. And as you rightly said, I think in 2050 we have to feed something like 9.5 billion people. And we really have to go for technology option. There's no escape.
With no more cuttable, there's no more land to use either.
There's no more land, water is limiting, so we
Yes.
need technology.
We can feed 9 billion people without resorting to this technology.
So we have, last word was disagreement. That's good. That's what we need in debate. So I'd like to thank you both for a very interesting discussion, and I hope it helps other people to understand this issue. Paula, you would like to make a few remarks?
So that was a very special presentation by the Science magazine called Science Matters, looking at the future of genetic technology, the future of genetic modification in food crops for a country like India, which has 1.2 billion population and growing. An important debate. It ended in disagreement between the two people who were proposing what they wanted to propose. But that is what science is all about, agreeing to disagree and taking the debate forward and bringing a certain view forward, which could be the consensus view. I thank Dr. Pushp Bhargava, the founding director of the Center for Cellular Molecular Biology, to have come and graced this occasion. I also thank Dr. Padmanabhan, former director of the Indian Institute of Science, Bangalore. I also thank this lowly vegetable, the brinjal, the eggplant, or the aubergine, which has made controversy in India and across the world. It has brought to fore that a technology like this of genetic modification, should it be used by people, should it not be used by people? An important discussion and debate has taken place. I also thank Dr. Bruce Alberts, our lovable editor-in-chief, for having articulately moderated this discussion. Thanks for watching, and keep watching this space. You will hear more from us.